Good evening, everyone. And this is a great privilege to be here on the platform provided by Kalinga Lit Fest. We call it KLF, on their platform called Bhasha Utsav. And this is just so appropriate to what we are trying to do today. And we have the presence also of E.V. Ramakrishnan, who I would introduce in a minute. And I do hope that our third panelist, who is Manu Devadevan, I wish he were to join us as soon as possible. He has been traveling, Devadevan has been traveling, and I hope that he's in the hills. So hopefully he will get connectivity and will be with us very soon, and we will introduce him and also have a kind of an interaction and get his ideas on the subject of our session today, which is multilingualism and diversity in modern Indian literature, issues and problematics. I think every word in this title becomes important in terms of what we want to discuss. Of course, multilingualism is the focus, which goes hand in hand with the diversity, cultural diversity. We are talking about modern and Indian and literatures. So each word, I think, needs to be looked at very carefully. And we need to really engage with this subject more and more to understand what kind of literature is happening. And who better than Professor E.V. Ramakrishnan, who is a poet, a critic, a translator who works between Malayalam and English and has published nearly 23 books, including, the edited volumes of poetry, literary criticism, and amongst his volumes of poetry in English are Being Elsewhere, In Myself, Terms of Seeing, New and Selected Poems, and many others. If I start reading out the list, it's really will really exhaust the time. So I would like to come to the subject as soon as possible. And also, of course, a very important anthology that he edited, which was of modern Indian poetry, The Tree of Tongues. I think that's very significant. And he himself, his own poetry has been collected, anthologized by many, many important poets, etc., who have been anthologizing. I'm very glad to welcome Manu. You two are here. Happy to see you and happy to see that you managed to connect from the mountains. I hope you are able to hear us and say hi to us. Are you able to hear us? I'm not sure that he can. However, let me introduce him very quickly. Manu V. Devadevan, welcome to you. He's a historian, associate professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi, poet, literary critic in Kannada. His academic publications, for which he's really very well known, one of them is a prehistory of Hinduism, which he published in 2016, and then many other works which he has translated. He himself is also a poet. He has two collections of poetry. He has been translating from different languages, and Kannada is one of them. And he's also been translating from Bengali. And in fact, I'm amazed to see that he is himself an epitome of multilingualism, as it were. So he's going to have a little bit of a problem, I think, of connectivity, and we will just have to bear with that. EVR, I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to, just keep bridging the gaps here and there wherever we can, because he is going to be in and out of the scene, and he's involved in some kind of a project which is happening in Chamba. And Chamba does mean, he's in a valley, and the mountains can be very obstructive also, while they're very pleasant to be there. So I do hope that we are able to go, I hope we are going to be able to listen to him. Now, this topic that we are talking about, it says, Manu, can you hear us now? In your absence, we have already introduced you. I hope that we are going to be able to hear you. So, what I was going to share with everyone is that this is in the context of a series of books in which all of us are involved. EVR is involved in doing a book on O.V. Vijayan, and Manu Devan is also doing a book on Devanura Mahadev, the Kannada writer. And I have done my work on Krishna Sopti, and there are, all in all, there are going to be 11 books that are going to come out in this series called Writer in Context. And if we are talking about this series, almost all of the authors that we have picked up belong to the same time, which is the post-independence India. And in this context, you will see that there are lots of divergences, but there is also a convergence that one sees somewhere. So I don't want to use the cliche term unity in diversity, but there is absolutely no doubt in saying that each of the writers that we recognize as an important writer is a representative in a way of a specific culture, but at the same time is able to transcend that culture through his writings or her writings. So that is, in fact, in a way, leading them to be recognized as absolutely iconic writers. And in this series, obviously, there are many issues that we see emerging. And one of the issues that we need to engage with is the multilingualism that is present in our Indian literatures. We cannot just glib about this idea that multilingualism is an environment in which we live, and we thrive in multilingualism, but do we really academically engage so much with it? Unfortunately, what has happened over the last many years is that we have almost in our education, we have become monolingual. Or at the most, one subsidiary kind of attention is given to another language. And we think in terms of one mother tongue, just as in England, they thought of one mother tongue. I truly believe that we have many mother tongues, in fact, and that within our own selves there is a multilingualism that is operative. And I think we need to recognize that even if we ultimately declare that an author is writing in one specific language, there are so many other currents of languages. Like for instance, if we are talking about a writer like Krishna Sopti, she wrote in Hindi, but in her Hindi, there is a shadow and mediation between Hindi, mainstream kind of Hindi, and Punjabi at times, depending on what novel she's writing, where the characters are situated. And the language varies dynamically, as it were. Hindi becomes a different Hindi in a different novel, depending on which locale she's talking about. So, in one writer herself, you see the evidence of multilinguality. Now, in this, how do we, particularly when it comes to translation, how do we transfer that kind of many Hindi situation in English language, where there is, in fact, an erasure in one sense and a homogenization that takes place, and we start wondering how to translate. So there are lots of issues that come up of translation. There are lots of issues that come up of how to understand the kind of diversity that you see within the same author and in the context, in a macro way, in the context of Indian literatures. So if we are looking at multilingualism, we are also trying to understand here that it's not enough to just celebrate and be sloganal about multilingualism or diversity, that if you really engage with it very seriously, the whole idea of diversity, there is a very important aspect to it that we need to understand. How do we nourish this diversity? We cherish it, but how do we nourish it in such a way that there is no erasure? But we also know that as time passes on, the so-called small languages, just because a lesser number of people may be talking in that language or speaking that language, those languages don't get adequately represented or showcased. And as a result of that, what happens is that slowly, official recognition not being there, there isn't adequate attention given to that writer, and it is the writer who becomes a savior at times, because she might just pick up the multilinguality which is existent in that particular language, which actually has the shadow of the so-called mainstream language, but at the same time it has its own cultural specificity which it carries as a language. And therefore I think it's important to make a study of that. And before I just go on and on, I think my main point that I want to sort of make here as one of the panelists here is, how do we not just celebrate, how do we nourish these languages and not get ensnared with the politics that have been created in terms of creation of a hierarchy of languages, and seeing that one language is more important than the other because there is a greater official recognition of one language in comparison to the other. So what do we do about it? We cannot really control these politics, that these are politics of power, and we do work in binaries many a times, but we have to see that this is so one dimension to it. There is multidimensionality also in each language. So how do we need to recognize this in the writer in context series. We are paying very close attention to some of these issues, so that the writers we present in their writing, we do make an effort to analyze this aspect and showcase how there is this diversity within the same author's writings as well. So that's one way of becoming aware, and through our teaching, through our discussions, through our debates, we also discuss the problematics involved in being able to do so, because our classroom and our formal pursuit of knowledge, as it were, of literature, is actually normally taken on by monolingual norms. So, how do we have a breakthrough in that? EVR, would you like to take over?
Yeah, let me respond to some of the ideas you already flagged. And there are many complex issues which emerge in the context of multilingualism. And definitely, we are looking at this very important cultural phenomenon in the context of the series, writers in context series, which all of us are concerned with. Uh, we need to remember that though we speak of very large number of languages uh, being spoken in India, almost 95% of Indians speak about 15 languages. You see, these 15 or around 15 languages actually have a very strong presence across India. So we need to actually look at the major and the minor languages. But what has to be noted is each of these major languages, uh, in a way, exist in the vicinity of many minor languages, and they are pierced by these is a minor languages through many is a cultural and many other is a it could be sometimes through religious kind of occasions, it could be through devotional literature, through many other. So we need to actually say no language exists as a self-contained entity in India, no major language. And once we realize this, we actually need to accept that in Indian languages, we cross the boundaries all the time. A writer like O.V. Vijayan is major work, which is still, it remains a classic, a landmark. Very often people divide the history of Malayalam novel into pre Legends of Kazakh and post Legends of Kazakh. Kazakh Idihasam becomes the turning point in the history. And what makes it a classic of such dimensions is its very original, highly creative use of what we technically call heteroglossia. You see, it's not dialect alone. You see, I very often argue that dialects exist in their own right as languages, along with the standard forms. So, what the dialects actually can visualize, what dialects, they have a cosmology of their own. What you can visualize through a dialect may not be is accessible through a standard kind of is a standardized mode of expression. And this standardization carries the imprint of what happened in the 19th century, and that is the colonial modernity. That's a long history. We can say a certain kind of, as I use the word, a piercing of Indian languages, of a worldview which is derived from the Enlightenment. And this in a way makes our languages themselves a site of uh, is a conflict. Our modernity itself is a kind of is a self division is a which needs to be worked out constantly through multiple kind of you see negotiations. So what Legends of Kazakh in a way does is you have educated, modernized hero with his own existential kind of angst, but then his encounter with a very complex society organically located in multiple dialects and several kind of cultural practices, it brings about a different kind of ambience to the very idea of modernity. So modernity itself is now under scrutiny. You see and this happens through the very structure of the novel. This happens through the very you see it is the heteroglossia which makes this kind of you see critique of the idea of modernity available. And let me add in this context, maybe you see Anantamurthy has a very interesting kind of you see metaphor. He talks about the front yard and the backyard. And in a very interesting essay, he says what he heard in his father in his own house. The front yard was where father spoke mostly in English, or maybe they quoted from Sanskrit, and they always had a universal kind of idiom to discuss a very large range of issues relating to not everyday world, a different kind of world altogether. World of ideas, world of many concepts, categories. But there at the backyard, mother engaged with illiterate women, and they always had stories to tell, food to share, and they also knew how to actually, in the process, share experience. So when a writer like Vaikam Muhammad Bashir writes a novel like Patuma's Goat, Patumede Ade, what you essentially get is the backyard of a certain view of the backyard, a certain this is the uh, space where standardized languages. So I am talking about the division within a language. You see, a language itself is pierced by multiple languages. So the English is not outside Malayalam. It will be a mistake You read Phanishwarnath Renu's Maila Anchal, English is very much inside the novel. You see, and there are 4 or 5 dialects of Hindi very much spoken in that you see, entire region, and which finds, along with Bengali and many other, you see, and you please, whenever you want to stop me, you can. We will, but then let me also bring it, you see, so when we talk of multilingualism as a living phenomenon in India, we need to actually think of how it has been creatively used, how it is actually a creative resource which, in a way, enables you see, the writers to locate themselves. But for, you see, the multiplicity of you see, this is not I have a whole lot of things to say on this. If you go back to you see, the medieval India, you do find this multilingualism as not a liability at all. People always live with many languages, and crossing over from one language to the other was natural. And you see, Eknath or many bhakti poets would use you see, Marathi along with you see, a highly Urduized or Persianized kind of you see, dialect of Marathi. So when you Persianize Marathi, you have a certain kind of you see, complex subjectivity entering the novel. So that's what happens with Vijayan. The moment the dialect actually enters the very standard language, it puts it in a way puts the standard language to scrutiny. The subjectivity created through a certain colonial modernity and its narrative is now subjected to a certain kind of critical gaze. And this critical gaze can only come from the margins. It can come only from what I have actually recently, when I spoke on Bashir, I used the word how he confronted the minors. So, how the minor within the language, how do we actually come to terms with, you see, of late, what Dalit experience or women's experience or tribals experience, all these are available only through a certain confrontation, encounter with the minor, which our hegemonic kind of you say, standardized idioms, our hegemonic presence of English and Sanskrit have, you see, to many, to a much extent, you see, not enabled. They have been, you see, I would end with one example. You see, Sanskrit, I have actually pointed out this in on many occasions in some of my essays. There are hardly any major work in translation. Sanskrit, you take 2000 years of Sanskrit language history, you may find translation. I am not saying there are no translation, but you look at Sheldon Pollock's mammoth study, monumental, the language of gods. The word translation doesn't occur in his index, which runs to 40 pages, almost 35 to 40 pages. This singular absence of the idea of translation within the what he calls Sanskrit cosmopolis points to the lack of dialogism within the very is a cultural cosmopolis which Sanskrit is represented.
Yeah.
And to a great extent, what enabled Bhasha literature to come into their own was the ability to assimilate through translation, assimilate the minor voices. As a parallel, in a novel, a Muslim will speak, or a Dalit or a woman will speak there is a dialect available. And this is a multiplicity of languages uh, creates a certain major resource, and we need to actually look at this phenomenon as a very important in the context of Vijayan or context of many other. I mentioned Adhagav. I can actually a novel like Adhagav can never be written without the idea of the minor becomes so complex in a novel of this kind. Maybe we'll take up more
Yeah,
issues.
yeah.
I'm
I think
sorry.
we need to, yeah. I think some of these things that you're talking about, particularly in the context of modernity and
Yeah,
how it went hand in hand in our context in India in particular, when it goes into the lap of the pundits, for instance, and the notion of purity comes up.
yeah,
And when we are talking about the purists,
yeah,
I know for a fact that in Urdu itself,
mm,
which is actually supposed to be an eclectic kind of a
mm, mm,
language, where it has taken words from different languages and
mm,
has come
mm,
together in
mm,
a very syncretic fashion.
mm,
And but we know that there is a Lucknow school, for instance, which talked about pure Urdu language, and
mm,
started and thanks to these, almost like it's something to do with intellectual Brahmanism, as it
mm,
were,
yeah,
which developed with the hierarchy that came up
yeah,
first within the language also, but
mm,
also it has a lot to do between, say, as you rightly put it, the dialect and the so-called main language,
yeah,
which seems to be branching out. But today we know that we have
mm,
recognized Awadhi as a language unto
language.
itself.
Mm,
But for a
mm,
long time, when
mm,
people were talking about what did Tulsi write in
mm,
what language, and
mm.
people would say Hindi, you know.
Hindi.
And well, there's use
Mm,
of dialect there of
mm,
Awadhi,
mm.
which is not
Yeah,
true. It is actually Awadhi
yeah,
in itself. So this
same.
that
Mm,
respectability
mm,
that needs to be given, it is not built into our both pedagogical practice, nor
mm,
is it built into the policy of the state or the regional context. So I think first and foremost there is a need, a very pressing need, to
yeah,
recognize and acknowledge this whole idea of the different streams entering, linguistic streams entering into a network, as it were,
yeah,
and flowing into each other. And that is why I think Ramanujan uses a very good word for this. I mean, how in the telling of tales, for instance, there is an element of autotelic tales, they travel from one end to the other. And he gives a very beautiful example
mm,
of the
mm,
flowering tree, for instance. And it might, when it takes root in Canada, it says one thing, but as it is moving and carrying within itself a cultural baggage, and it travels up to the north, to Kashmir, there are variations of geography and culture, but there is something to do. It has something to do with the network that is fluid, and there are cross currents all the time. And that is the beauty of the subcontinent here. It's not limited to the political boundaries of states, and particularly when we are talking about, states having linguistic identity, and that identity needs to be forever challenged. All the time it needs to be challenged, because the borders on that, from that point of view, are absolutely porous, and they better be porous, because the
yeah,
dynamism of culture has to actually be realized the way it is lived. And
mm,
it has to be, it is best captured in literature that is produced.
mm,
And I'm sure Manu would have a lot to say in this context, because I think we need to see, the examples that come from, as you rightly said, medieval poets, how there is a voice of, for instance, dissent, which we think of as a very contemporary phenomenon, the kind of democratic voice that you have in those poets. And whether it is dissent or protest or questioning, interrogating the established, it's out there. And today, for instance, it becomes even more difficult to acquire that voice, because in education we are homogenized, totally. Because in and the kind of education that we are educated into standardization of thought, of imagination, of articulation, and we are blinded to the heterogeneity of culture and languages that exists all around us. Manu, over to you.
Thank you, Suprita and EVR. Hope you can hear me.
Yes?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can.
Well, a lot of issues to discuss here. This is a wonderful discussion. When I hear of multilingualism, which of late I hear all too often, there are two pieces of thought that occur to me. One is Jacques Derrida's famous words that he knows or he has only one language, and that's not his language. Predictable words because they come from Derrida. The other is less outlandish, I should say, and for my purposes, more important, as it were. It comes from U.R. Ananthamurthy, the iconic Kannada writer. I'm glad EVR mentioned him. Ananthamurthy often made this remark that the people in rural Karnataka, who were mostly illiterate until the 1990s, speak at least three languages. Region is, of course, home to speakers of numerous languages: Tamil, Konkani, Telugu, Marathi, Lambani. There are a million speakers of Lambani in Karnataka. Kodava, Deccani, Malayalam, of course. So there are about anywhere between 150 and 200 languages in Karnataka, and at least a dozen of them have more than a million speakers. My friend Basavaraj Kodagunti, who happens to be a linguist, tells me that the Dakshina Kannada district has over 150 languages. A single district alone has more than 150 languages, and Kannada speakers in this district is less than 30%. On the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the Mandya district, where Kannada speakers are about 93%. Now, Ananthamurthy interestingly said that the kind of multilingualism that one finds among the illiterate people in rural Karnataka is just not there among the literate sections of the people living in the big cities. So his hypothesis is that the more literate you are, the less the number of languages you know, and vice versa. The less one is literate, the more number of languages that one can communicate. So I think Ananthamurthy is making a very significant point. One can, of course, find exceptions to what he's saying. Both EVR and I are among the exceptions. But if one were to do a systematic piece of research, I'm sure one will realize that Ananthamurthy was indeed right. Now, I'm reminded of a famous experiment, a linguistic experiment that the linguist Lera Boroditsky carried out some years ago. Now, she asked a group of German speakers to write a few words that describe a bridge. Now, most of them wrote, it is elegant, it's an elegant bridge, it's a slender bridge, it's fragile, it's beautiful, it is of such and such color, and so on and so forth. Now, she repeated the experiment with a group of Spanish speakers. And this time, the respondent said, that's a massive bridge, that's a towering bridge, it's strong, it's dangerous, it's sturdy, and so on. Now, there is a reason for this difference in response, Boroditsky says. The word for bridge in German is in the feminine gender, and it's in the masculine gender in Spanish. So I often wonder what the result might have been had she studied the multilingual population in Karnataka. It appears to me that being multilingual is something that comes rather naturally. Naturally is not the correct word. Rather effortlessly. It comes rather effortlessly, but it takes not a little effort to confine oneself to a single language. To be proud of a language, to wear a language identity on one's sleeves, that takes a hell lot of effort. So Ananthamurthy often made another observation. Some of the finest 20th century Kannada writers did not have Kannada as their mother tongue. Devudu Narasimha Shastri spoke Telugu at home. Masti Venkatesh Iyengar spoke Tamil. Dara Bendre spoke Marathi. Shivaramakaran spoke Tulu. Girish Karnad spoke Konkani. In fact, the Tamil-speaking Masti often, on one occasion, he mocked the Kannada-speaking Kuvempu for using too many Sanskrit words in one of his writings. So he said, "Kannada lipiyalli Samskrita padagala denidu meravanige." What is this procession? What is this procession of Sanskrit words in the Kannada script? And both Masti and Kuvempu, of course, wrote in English as well. So multilingualism, I think, has a very long history in India. In fact, the 16th century Kannada poet Ratnakara Varni says in his Bharatesha Vaibhava that his work in Kannada was much appreciated by people who spoke Kannada, Telugu, as well as Tulu. And Sanskrit, of course, has had a ubiquitous presence, and this was not limited to the upper castes. See, the kind of deep knowledge that knowledge of the language Sanskrit that one finds in the 12th century Kannada saint poet Urilinga Petti is simply amazing. And when one studies the life of Narayana Guru from 19th century Kerala, one notices something similar. He had a profound understanding of Sanskrit and wrote works such as the Darshanamala in Sanskrit, in addition to works in Tamil and of course in Malayalam. His father, Madanashan, was both a Sanskrit scholar and a Malayalam scholar, and so were his maternal uncles, Raman Vaidyan and Krishnan Vaidyan. And Swati Tirunal, who died a few decades before Narayana Guru was born, wrote in Malayalam, he wrote in Sanskrit, he wrote in Tamil, Telugu, he wrote in Hindi. So the use of multiple languages in a single text was also known. That's very interesting, and I think that is something that we have not given adequate thought to. For example, the 17th or 18th century Kannada poet Mahipati Dasa has these lines where you find Kannada, where you find Telugu, as well as Deccani Urdu. It goes something like this: "Dekho bhai dikhta tumna nazro mein ತನ್ನೊಳಗೆ ಅತಿ ಸೂಕ್ಷ್ಮವಾಗಿ ತಿಳುಕೋ ಮೇ ಸದ್ಗುರು ವಚನ ಶೋಧುನಿ ಚುಡುವಯ್ಯ ಉನ್ನ." You have Deccani in this, you have Kannada in this. It's the same poem. In three different lines, he's using three different languages, and he's not trying to communicate three different things. That's the most important thing here. So I think the decline in multilingualism in India had to do with print capitalism and the kind of linguistic public spheres that it brought into being in the last 200 years. So this, I think, qualifies the point that Ananthamurthy was trying to make. Now, things, I think, become a little tricky when it comes to translation. Since I'm doing this volume on Devanur Mahadeva, so I can see that happening everywhere. This is particularly true when writers. There are writers who write with a deep level of consciousness about the question of language itself. And some of them want to invent a register that does not actually exist. Devanur is a fine example. So his work, Kusuma Bale, uses the dialect spoken in some parts of Mysore, southern Mysore, but only in some parts. And he blends this dialect with a language register of his own. So what we have then is not a language made familiar by the printing press. It is not a colloquial language either. So it's a kind of, what shall I say, it's a kind of hyper language, where much is sought to be communicated through the aura of the language itself, and not by what the assemblage of signifiers might actually signify. It brings about the complexity of a multilingual situation within Kannada itself. Sukrita was actually mentioning this in the Hindi context. And this is something that has generated mixed response from critics within Karnataka. Some have celebrated this as something. A number of critics have celebrated this, but others have actually written it off as some kind of an acrobatics or an instance of bad faith writing. So this has also generated a lot of debate within the Kannada public sphere about what a language is, and can a writer invent his or her own language and bring in all the elements of multilingualism that is possible in that kind of an expression.
Yeah, I think there are lots and lots of points that you have raised so beautifully, Manu. And I really feel that it resonates very well with, what you're saying of Kannada, for instance, it resonates very well with what the writers are trying to do in other languages also in India. When you use a very beautiful term, hyper language. I think this is what Panishwarnath Renu does. When he writes Anchalik in that context, it's not as if that particular language is actually spoken, but he picks up some words, colloquialisms, etc., and creates an idiom which shows that it's a very rooted culture that he's trying to depict. And it works very well. And so it's a geography, it's a culture that comes out of a geography. And so the admixture of vocabulary that you see in him, it's kind of similarly, I think in other gaons something like that is happening, Razas, So I think there is also this wonderful, and I want to say something here about what happens in eco diversity does also happen. The same thing happens in the diversity of languages as well, because it inspires a writer to create yet another language, right? So the fertility of imagination that it comes to is, I think, it works beautifully, and greater creativity happens, just as forests which are diverse would have wonderful prosperous vegetation out there, and there would be diversity. But unfortunately, the at the state level, policy level, it's obviously these things are not taken into cognition, because perhaps we are not adequately paying attention to the kind of discussion that we are having, and we are enjoying it because we are seeing it very realistically. We are also able to get flashes of insights, as to what is happening through language. And language is giving a very language, we know, we often talk about it as identity, but do we pay attention at all to the sounds that we hear in oral traditions? Are we paying attention to it academically? Because those are the sounds which require a certain attention, because orality has a dialogic relationship with the written word also, right? So how is the oral getting into the written, and written getting into the oral? That in itself is creating yet another language, right? And that language, I think, is growing forever in a dynamic fashion, but it is happening on the ground. But we are not doing it in the classroom, we are not doing it on the research table. And I think that is what we need to really become a little more aware of this, and find our language and critical tools to dissect all this, which is different from the Western monolingual centers that we have in different countries. So this difference has to be realized. And in fact, when we talk about the other, in uh, when we are trying to translate, that is another victim. The other becomes the victim, the other the consciousness of the other. And how do we particularly when we are talking about translations into English, because English is going to have that, what I often say, it's like a tractor like thing which levels out and smoothens out all the beautiful curves and cracks and everything into standardization. So if we become conscious and very, very sort of careful about the value of this cultural specificity that language is going to give us, alertness to language is going to give us, automatically in our translation, we'll try to be we'll at least try to carry that into our translation. So that takes us into a very broad theme of how is translation taking care or not taking care of multilingualism. Would you have something to say about this, Evia? Because we are all translators. We know, how we struggle, and then throw up our arms and say, no, can't do it. Or, we have an equivalent somewhere, which is not really taking care of the other. Differences are not taken care of.
Yeah, in fact, it's a very complex question. I would say a certain kind of history of colonization has also gone into the making of this very complex situation, where the other you mentioned. You see, when we had these scheduled and non-scheduled languages, you see, the whole idea of you can see as Ganesh Devi has mentioned it, most of the Burmese languages, Austro-Asiatic languages, they exist largely at the level of orality. So there is a certain sense in which, and we also know, regional languages themselves can become highly hegemonic. You did mention Awadh and Bhojpuri and many other. And their texts are written in Bhojpuri, and their novels are written, or epics are written in Awadhi. But then we don't consider them as major works. We consider them as Hindi works. How do we translate them? Recently I was reading, this situation is not peculiar to India. I was reading an African novel. I think Alan McCabe, the name of the novel was Broken Glass. Now, this particular African writer, who is a Congolese French novelist, he says before he entered formal education, he knew about 5 to 6 languages, all what we may say tribal or quote unquote African languages. And then his entire education was in French. And he studied law, he became a novelist and a poet, etc. And then he began writing a kind of fiction. The language he used was Congolese French, which tried to, in a way, bring back the forgotten languages. How do you bring back the languages? He never knew that these languages were there within him. And he never uses full stop. I think he uses only comma and no. And this novel is quite a complex novel, Broken Glass. And it has got allusions, references to all the major, what you call European classics, and in a very ironical kind of context. You see, the level of, that's where the penetration of the European into the African. How do you handle that as a linguistic experience? How do you handle and represent it as a cultural, intercultural kind of textual, a new kind of textuality comes into being? And that's what I think you hear in Vijayan or Devanur Mahadev. I would actually rather say, instead of saying they create a hyper language, I would rather say they are actually creating a new kind of textuality which is not bounded by a certain grammar of the homogeneity or the syntax of colonial modernity, which controls our expression, our a whole lot of things. So the real multilinguality is fought, or it's something which needs to be encountered. It's one of the major resources. That is one which I would underline. Secondly, we have not actually in a way configured its theoretical. We are not theorized even vernacular or this whole idea of the heteroglossia within. A language being pierced by, when Manu says there are 150 languages spoken in South Canada, Ganesh Devi's popular survey says in Assam about 750 languages are spoken. And we would say Assam, the only language spoken is Assamese. In Kerala, maybe there should be more than 200 or 300 languages. There are tribal, there are many. And these, what we have created a print language of standardized syntax, standardized vocabulary, standardized kind of view of the world, homogenized idea of a universality. All these are now coming unstuck. We can actually very well see, and a certain creative kind of this can happen only through what I would say a dynamic multilinguality, uh, in a way, taking over as the site of creative imagination. We need to actually see it as the site of imagination. You see, how do you, maybe my own area, one study has been modernism, and you see, the shift from modern to postmodern, or modernist, high modernism to postmodernism, is largely uh, through the negotiation of the multiplicity of languages, which are somehow created, which were not recognized. Take any major poet, whether it is Ajay or whether it is Ayyappa Panikkar, or there is always this larger problem of confronting the minor, confronting the other. But then that movement of postmodern actually so it comes through many issues, many such problematic. It could be a move away from high modernism to the postmodernism. It could be a move, a text by Vijayan is as much postmodern as it is modernist. So the very complex configuration of what we call modernist in Devanur Mahadeva or Anantamurthy or Vijayan, that would bring out a whole lot of this idea of being pierced by other languages, which is what I
Yeah.
emphasize as
Yeah. Yeah, I think one particular point comes out very clearly, that it's a, the way naturally translatability gets built into our consciousness, of from one language to another, the way we move from one language to another. I remember Meenakshi Mukherjee talking about it and
yeah.
saying, we are essentially multilingual people. And so, even in our ordinary conversation, we move from one language to another very easily. And that has something to do with the fact that there is enough vocabulary, diverse vocabulary available to us all the time, so that we can communicate in a variety of ways. But honestly speaking, a lot of it, even in conversation, is getting erased. We can see that it gets erased because of the very standardized education that we receive, and literacy in particular, that we have already made a point of. Now, I would like to say that even in the context of, when you look at, see, language of women, for instance, there was a lot of vocabulary. And why would we say that, women were silent? They were not silent. The idea has been, in fact, either there is a silence that is recognized there, or too much of chatter. Women talk a lot, either it is that, or it is that they don't talk at all and there is silence. Now, certainly there has been the shadow of the cultural inhibitions in terms of articulation of certain not feminist, but female, I would like to use the word female experience, And as a result, there has been, and I like that term that you use, EVR, of piercing the language. I think people like Ismat Chugtai were great in doing that. She actually pierced Urdu language in a very big way and found space in the larger use of language in poetics, validated the idea that women could find words and do have their own way of, whether it is decorative or exaggerated, or the language of gossip or scandal, which she actually picked up by as a child, when she would hide under the bed or behind the door, listening to older women talk to each other and picking up words and giving that space, legitimacy as women's language. And of course, we know about it, that it is called Begumati Zuban. And ultimately, people had to come to accept it, and now women's language, which means we are empowering women then. Same would be true of the rural and other so-called marginalized communities. Fisher people, for instance, have their own vocabulary. It's a question of recognition. It's a question of validation. It's a question of acceptance. And as I said, on the ground, these things are happening naturally, but we are not acknowledging all of that. And I just hope that as translators, we at least point out to these features more and more and become more available ourselves and make others available of the beauty of language and how it can reach and pierce ideas and emotions into fuller expression. There is no complete expression, but fuller expression rather than, tabooed expression. Manu, would you have to say something about that?
No, I want to problematize the two things that came up now. One is the question of colonialism that EVR raised, and the second is the question of gender. And I want to add a third dimension to it, which is race. Now, under this kind of a complex scenario, there might be translations which are quite faithful to the original, faithful within quotes, but it can generate a completely different semiotic when it comes to English. Now, take for instance the Vachanas of Akka Mahadevi, in which she uses a signature word, which is Chenna Mallikarjuna. Now, some translators, Shiva Prakash, for instance, retain this, but there are a few others, A.K. Ramanujan, for instance, who translate the signature as well. And he renders this as Lord White as Jasmine. That is what Chenna Mallikarjuna actually means. Chenna is beautiful, Mallika is the jasmine, and Arjuna is white. This opposite of Krishna. So Mallikarjuna is someone who is white as jasmine. Now, so in that sense, Ramanujan was quite faithful to the original, but it generated, I'm told that it generated a wholly different semiotics when these were taught in some of the universities in the US, where for them, this was something like an naked indigenous women looking for a white man. The whole meaning and the context completely changes when you bring in gender, race, and colonialism together. So we could even problematize it even further.
Yeah, I'm afraid, I think it's really taking us into avenues which are very beautiful because they're beautiful and more complex than what can be made out in the way we are finding language to articulate all this. But I really feel that we will have to bring this to a closure now because we are supposed to be finishing this by 9 p.m. And if there are any questions by anyone or if there's any other point that we are dying to share amongst ourselves, please go ahead and articulate that. Is there any question from the audience? I'm not sure. Is there? If there isn't, we can still continue for maybe about 5 more minutes and raise some points. EVR, would you like to speak and say something about the point that Manu made about race?
I would, on this question of translating the difference, you see, we always have English in mind. You see, when we take up this, I do feel, you see, when these vachanas of Basava, when they come into Malayalam, this problem perhaps will not actually arise. So definitely English translations give the Indian writers a certain visibility, and increasingly in the globalized cultural politics that we are actually now living, English has become the desirable. There is a kind of desire which is operating in the idea of translation. I think if we English you invariably come across in all reviews of translation that it reads like the original. If it reads like the original, then the whole idea of translation, I think, like Benjamin, I would actually say it should assault your sensibility. There is, there should be, that's where I accept Manu's, a certain flavor you can bring in through. There are key words in a text. How is a text organized? And certain is a verbal kind of knots. Something is knotted and threaded, and such things is a cannot. So you should know, as a translator, you should be able to bring in the original. Let people work hard and is a find out what this Kannada word means, or what this Urdu word means. You see, there is a felt need to actually, very often, you see, Dilip Menon is putting together an anthology of certain key words which we cannot translate. For example, in Malayalam, we have the word Nam. Nam is not we. You see, Nam actually, it's a very complex idea behind. You see, when you have Nyangal and Nam, you see, uh, where do we actually, how do you translate the word Nam into English? I always used to actually have, my translation class always had this kind of very complex, you see, I would take one paragraph, and you see, sometimes the discussion would go for 1 week. You see, you take maybe the Marathi novel Kosla with the Hindi translation, original Marathi plus English, you can actually find the situations where Marathi is a wonderful translation. He passed away recently, wonderful translator. But then many of, you see, the tone is captured in Hindi with, you see, with much, you see, there is a vocabulary native to this kind of a novel. This novel has an operative kind of syntax, which is not anglicized syntax. For example, vagaira, how do you, it's not etc. You see, because that doesn't, you see, this whole idea of vagaira, you see, etc. in Marathi, so you may have to bring in etc. But then in the classroom, we need discussions of this kind. I think
Yes.
many, how is a text noted? A text is something, it's a set of relation. Text is not something with a clear boundary. I feel the words on the page are always, you say, trying to slip out. So we translator, how do you make that page something living, you see, where words, so maybe multiple translations help us, you see. Manu's example become, this example became accessible because there are 2 translations or 5 translations. You see, then things become a little. But we need translation studies if our translation process really has to take off.
And I think also, if I may add, we need more and more, translated text to be reviewed. We need reviewers of
Yeah,
translations.
definitely.
Because
Yeah,
what is happening is that we are not creating, particularly in English, we are not creating readership of translations. People who feel that they are being challenged in as far as the meaning is concerned. When we are talking about so-called faithful in quotes translation, then there is a kind of, those knots have to be retained as knots.
Exactly.
One doesn't have to, unravel them, because that is the beauty of the text. And who are we to explain? We are not supposed to be explaining as translators. We are supposed to be carrying the experience of the text across into another language. And so
fluency, sorry, I am
carried.
Sukrita, there is invariably reviewers are monolingual, and you see, they will review any translation, and the bilingual translators hardly ever
get that's true. That's true.
Text.
But unfortunately, this is what is happening about, when it comes to the publishers. They keep talking about how should you make the text readable. Now, readable means actually standardize it, standardize it. And they would always, till recently, the audience used to be, or the readership would be, the target was the Western readership. But even if it is not the West today, but the Western sensibility within
Very
India
mm.
has to
Yeah,
be catered to. And
yeah.
that is where there is a problem, I think.
Problem.
And I think
Very
you're
good.
right when you say that we need to make an effort to understand. Do
Exactly.
a little bit of research. Let
Yeah.
the translation challenge you a little bit.
Mm, mm.
After all, the Russians managed to do it
Yeah.
to some extent. They managed to
Mm.
do it. And their
Yeah.
books were being sold. They brought
Mm.
it out very attractively, whatever, even
Attractive. Yeah.
children's literature.
Mm.
But they
Very.
retained a lot of the culture within that to
Mm.
some extent, they
Yeah.
did. And we
Mm.
bought it. We bought that culture because we
Yeah.
wanted to understand it.
Yeah.
But in our case, even that desire to understand is kind of
Mm.
being eliminated. Make it
Eliminate.
readable. And
Yeah.
that's where what are your wise last words, Manu?
You are
Wise
in the
last words.
mountains.
Well, yes,
The
EVR,
wise man
yours.
in the mountains.
Your sorry? Yeah, no, there is going to be no summing up because all these are open questions. No summing up, but just what would
Yeah.
you like to say at the end?
No, EVR just mentioned this whole thing of desirability that you have for English,
Mm.
which I find is quite interesting, particularly in a vernacular context such as that of Kannada, where it shares a very difficult relationship with the proponents of primary education in Kannada. And there comes the question of caste again, because most of the Dalit intellectuals in Karnataka would like to have primary education in English. The matter gets even more complicated when a leading Dalit intellectual, Devanura Mahadeva, sides with the other group, and
Yeah.
he advocates for primary schooling in Kannada. So the whole thing becomes extremely complex. But at the same time, most of these advocates of Kannada themselves have a desire for English and would like to see their work translated into English rather than Telugu or Malayalam or Tamil.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in a way, thankfully, it does come into English and we are able to read in the North, right?
Yeah.
So there are pluses and minuses on that. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I think this kind of conversation should go on and we will again meet soon and carry over some of what we do need to discuss over and over again in order to get into the complexity and not just say it is complex, but
Yeah.
then how do we get into it? How do we engage with it? I think that we need to do more often. And thank you so much for making yourself available, EVR, and
Yeah.
spending
Thank you.
this
It's
time.
always,
Thank you, thank you,
And
Super.
thank you,
Thank you,
Manu.
EVR.
And I think
Yeah.
it has been very both enjoyable and educative for us to be engaged with this particular subject. Thank you very much, Kalinga. Literary Festival KLF has come to our rescue in giving us the platform always so easily. But Zindabad Bhasha Utsav, that is what we are trying to do, to celebrate Bhasha. But we want to celebrate it meaningfully so that we understand ourselves more as to what business are we trying to get involved in. The kind of work that we do needs to be more understood by us and others together. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks.